I want to just give you the open mic here to respond to Mike Pence's theory of why he will never have to testify to a grand jury.
Well, you're right, Lawrence. It's a pretty pathetic political ploy, clearly designed to curry favor with President Trump's base by making excuses for President Trump and refusing to testify under oath, as he would have to and probably is going to have to, about the way Trump tried to force Pence into basically stealing the presidency that he had lost for the former president, and incidentally getting power for himself. And of course, part of the reason for the ploy is that he wants to be president of the United States. It's not only the text that you, I think, helpfully read to your viewers that makes clear that Mike Pence is not entitled to invoke the shield of the speech and debate clause. It's what he said himself on the morning of January 6th, having gotten advice from the very distinguished former federal judge Michael Luttig. He confirmed that he is not going to play a senatorial or a congressional role or even much of a role at all. He said he was simply going to play a ceremonial role, the role given to him by the special clause in the Constitution that has the president of the Senate, who happens to be the vice president of the United States, open the electoral ballots and count them. He doesn't even have to have a calculator or an abacus. The counting is mechanical. He doesn't have a role to play. And his whole point was that because he has no role to play under the Constitution, this is not like the role of breaking a tie, which occasionally vice presidents do, a tie on an appointment, a tie on legislation. It's not like that. It is a very special role that is really much more like that of a kind of potted plant. And it's really interesting to see the way the former vice president, in a kind of chameleon-like way, when the legislative branch, when Congress, doing its January 6th hearing, asked for his testimony and sought it, he said, "I don't owe you guys anything because I'm not a member of the legislative branch. I am," although actually he wasn't any longer, "but I was a member of the executive branch. And now when the judicial branch and the grand jury conducted under the auspices of Jack Smith in the executive branch asks for his testimony, the chameleon changes colors and he says, oh, no, I am not really eligible to testify because I'm a member of the legislative branch, or at least I was." It's all false. Fact is that in any event, what Jack Smith wants is not even the speeches or debates that he may have made when he presided in his ceremonial role. It wants to know what Trump, who was, I think we all know, was never a member of the legislative branch, what Trump said to him in twisting his arm in the White House, which, when I last looked, is not part of the Capitol. What did Trump say to him then in the lead up to January 6th to try to pressure him into a kind of bloodless coup? And then perhaps what did he say on January 6th? So this is a crazy argument. It's one that is being augmented by another equally crazy separation of powers argument. I don't think that the chief judge of the district court down there, Beryl Howell, will buy it for a moment. The D.C. Circuit is not going to buy it. And these delay efforts are not taking very much time anymore because it's so obvious that they are simply delay efforts. So it's a craven political move. It's foolish. It's not going to help him, even, I think, with the Trump base. So what else is new? It's simply another performance art, and not very good art at that.
We saw a remarkably fast appeals process, truly expedited in every sense of the word, in the documents case involving Donald Trump, in which Donald Trump lost in every forum that he went through after the district court. But on the other hand, on the Donald Trump tax returns, they were basically bottled up by a district court judge in Washington, D.C., who was appointed by Donald Trump, who ran out almost a couple of years of the clock all by himself, by just sitting there for many, many months at a time, not issuing rulings in the case. What do you expect to be the timetable on a situation like this, which clearly will be appealed?
I think it's going to be much faster. This is not going to get stuck with any one judge who wants to brush it under the rug. Now, I think the nature of what's going on is clearer to everybody. I think this is going to zoom through the courts, and it's not really going to cause any terrible delay. It's still an abuse of the judicial system, and there's always a risk that by the time it gets to this very right-wing U.S. Supreme Court, things may not go as predicted. But with Lindsey Graham, several people, including me, predicted that his attempt to say that the speech and debate clause protected him wouldn't go very far, and it didn't take long for this Supreme Court to slap that down. I think it would do the same here. After all, those people at least have some interest in seeming like judges. They don't always act judiciously, but I don't really worry very much about what they're going to do with this case.